1, verses 8 through 21, and I will read before this morning's message. Daniel's faithfulness. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse conditions than the youth who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter, and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none were found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all of the magicians and the enchanters who were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. We invite Pastor Wayne to give us this morning's message.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you as we continue in our series in the book of Daniel. Put that there. Even if you don't have a Christian background, you might know some of the events that happened in the book of Daniel, right? You have the fiery furnace, you have the Daniel and the lion's den, and many famous events throughout the book of Daniel. And but even before we get to those, right? And those events are really amazing, and a lot to learn from them. But it's important to remember that the book of Daniel, as we're here in chapter 1, actually begins in a rather tragic way. Right, because Daniel here in chapter 1, he was just a young teenager. We think, right, maybe 15 years old or so, and he's taken away from his homeland. Right, he was in Jerusalem when the Babylonians came and besieged it and took it over. He was taken from his homeland, taken away from his family, right, and he was shipped about 500 miles away and put into a society, in a Babylonian society, that sought to completely abolish his Jewish identity. Right, and to conform him to the Babylonian way of life. And so, in some ways, we really should be talking about Daniel, even if he just survived, all of that. But as we see throughout the book of Daniel, what happens is that he actually thrives in that environment. Right, he continues to be faithful to God all throughout his life. And we actually see a little bit hint of this in the first chapter. I just want to briefly start with the very end of the chapter in verse 21, right? It says, and Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Now, if you're here last week, or if you know a little bit of history, I've recently got into history and started watching history YouTube channels. There's amazing presentations out there on all sorts of things you can ever imagine. And so if you know a little bit of history, this passage here is a little bit interesting because if you know Cyrus the Great, he actually wasn't a Babylonian king. Right, he was actually a Persian king, right? And so all the way here at the end of the first chapter, what you see a little bit of hint of here is that the book of Daniel is telling you that Daniel is going to be lived a really long time, and he's going to live all the way from his transportation in Babylon all the way until King Cyrus the Great, and that spans about 80 years, right? So we know that Daniel lived probably a little past 80, and he actually is, and we'll probably cover this at the end of the book too, but he actually sees the first group of people go back to Jerusalem, right? So he was part of the first group that was taken to Babylon, and he catches the last little bit of the first group that actually goes back into Jerusalem. Daniel himself would never ever return back to Jerusalem, right? But his lifespan goes through the entire exile. And so what this verse is hinting at is that Daniel was faithfully serving God all of his life, right? And as we study this book here today, as we go through the series, I think one of the main things that we want to see, right, is how do we maintain faithfulness to God in a culture that also seeks to conform us and also seeks to push us away from God, right, away from our faith. But one of the things that I said last week, and I'll continue to say this throughout our series, is that very, very rarely will you hear me say, just be like Daniel. Because if we pay close attention to each passage, what we really see here is not really Daniel's faithfulness to God, but really what we see here is God's faithfulness to Daniel every single step of the way. Right? And the reason why Daniel was able to be faithful to God all those years is because God is the one who empowers him, encourages him, and enables him to live a life that is honoring to him. And for us today, this is no different, because the same God who was at work in Daniel's life, the same God that Daniel prays to throughout his book, is the same God who is now at work in my life and in your life, in our lives today, in our church today. Right, our God is the same, right, yesterday, today, and forever. And so the God who was with Daniel is now with us, right? And he continues to work out his perfect plan through imperfect people like you and me. Right, and so I pray that as we go through the book of Daniel, it'll really help us thrive as well, right, in a culture perhaps that seeks to pull us away from God. So, Daniel and his friends have some pretty big trials that are coming up, right? Fiery furnace, lion's den, writing on the wall. So many things, big trials that are coming their way. But in this passage, while Daniel and his friends were just a teenager, we already see two things here in their life that allows them to thrive in Babylon. And that's what I want to show you today. Two things that kind of allowed Daniel and his friends to thrive. And the two things, I'll give them to you now, is this. One, even though Daniel was in Babylon, Babylon never owned him, right? Even though Daniel was in Babylon, Babylon never owned him. And secondly, he attributed all of his success to God, right? So what are two things that we see in this passage as Daniel's a teenager that allowed him to thrive in Babylon? Two things, even though Daniel was in Babylon, Babylon didn't own him. And secondly, he attributed his success to God. So let's take a look at this first one, right? So even though Daniel was in Babylon, Babylon never owned him. So if you look at verse 8, it says, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself." So one of the questions that we have to ask as we approach this passage is, why didn't Daniel eat the food? Right? Why didn't Daniel eat the food that was presented to him? And if you look at this verse, the only reason why Daniel gave as to why he didn't eat the food is because he said that the food would defile him. And so what does that mean? Well, if you look at the word defile, the word implies that this was not just a physical reason why Daniel chose not to eat the food. Right? It wasn't just because of health reasons that Daniel chose not to eat the food. But defile means that there's actually a spiritual reason, right, that Daniel chose not to eat. And so as a result, there's been numerous reasons that have been put forth, right, as to why Daniel didn't eat. And so probably the most popular explanation is that Daniel and his friends didn't eat the meat because the Old Testament law forbade the Israelites to eat certain kinds of animals, right? And certainly those kinds of animals that they weren't supposed to eat would be present at the king's table, right? And so that's the reason why Daniel chose to abstain. Now, I think this is possible. I think the only reason why it's not super convincing to me is because the Old Testament law actually doesn't forbade them to eat all meat, right? Actually just certain kinds of meat, right? And not only that, if you look forward, a little bit forward in chapter 10, you actually see Daniel eating meat. And so I'm not sure if it's, if this is the reason why. And also, the Old Testament never says you can't drink wine, right? And so Daniel also says, I'm not going to drink the wine. And so I'm not really sure if this was because it was against the Old Testament law that Daniel chose not to eat. Now, the second reason why Daniel and his friends might have abstained from the food is because most likely this food was being sacrificed to Babylonian gods, right, before it was served to the people, right? And so in many ways, like priests back then, and this is true for Israel as well, priests back then were kind of like chefs, right? And so like you bring your sacrifice, and then they sacrifice the meat, and then you got to eat it afterwards, right? There's actually in the Bible, there's only 2 types of offering that were completely burnt up, and you weren't supposed to eat it. But all the other types of offering, you go to the priest, they sacrifice the meat, and then you got to eat the meat. And so in some ways, maybe Daniel didn't eat the meat because it was idolatry, right? It was being sacrificed at the idol of Babylonian gods. Now, the only issue with this, at least I think for me, is that I think it's likely that the vegetables also would have been sacrificed before the Babylonian gods, before it was served to the people, right? And so Daniel might have still been involved in idolatry, even if he just ate the vegetables and the water. And so the third reason, and I think the most likely reason, is that the reason why Daniel did not eat the food is because eating the king's food would show an allegiance with the king of Babylon. Right? And so, the problem, I don't know if it was necessarily with the meat or with the sacrifice, but the problem is that this was the king's food. Right? And eating at the king's table was a special privilege that showed that he was aligned, or he was, together with the king of Babylon. So you actually kind of see this throughout the passage, where the food is labeled as the king's food. Right, so in the previous passage in verse 5, right, the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. So literally, right, what Daniel was eating was exactly what the king was eating. Right, or Daniel 1:8, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food. Or verse 13, then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you. All right, so I think the reason why Daniel didn't eat the food is because this was Daniel's way of saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, we want you and everyone else to know that we're not dependent on you to live. Right? It's going to be God that provides for us. Right? God is the one that is going to provide for us. And this is exactly what God does. Right? After 10 days of eating just vegetables and water, it says, at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Now this passage, it's interesting, verse 16, when it says took away their food, it could mean Daniel and his friends, or it could mean everyone in Babylon had to suffer because Daniel and his friends chose not to, only had vegetables and water. But I think it's likely that maybe it's just Daniel and his friends that just drank water and ate the vegetables. Now, this passage, I think somewhat obviously, is not about the spiritual benefits, of keeping a vegan diet. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But what happens after 10 days, right, as it says in this verse, is that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh. Now back then, having a little more meat on your bones was seen as a good thing because it was a sign of wealth, right? It was a sign of blessing, right? Because only rich people would be able to eat enough, right, to have like substantial meat on their bones, right? So it was only the wealthy that were able to eat well. So even when it says that they were fatter in flesh, right, that was seen as a good thing. And if you think about this is actually the opposite of what you would expect, right? If you only eat vegetables and water, right? How is it that you become fatter in flesh, right? And you might become like better in appearance, right? Because you're like cutting out the oil, cutting out the fat, cutting out the bad stuff, right? So you might look better in appearance, but you probably wouldn't be fatter in flesh. Right now, like I've been on diets for at least 10 days, and I don't think I look any better than I did before. But 10 days was enough for the Babylonian officials to look at them and be like, you actually look better, right? And there's actually more meat on your bones. And so I think really what's happening here is God's faithfulness to Daniel, right? Because this shouldn't really happen, right? Maybe there's doctors or nutritionists out there that can correct me, but this really shouldn't happen, right? That if you just eat vegetables and water, that you get more meat on your bones, right? So I think really what we see here is a miracle, right? This is a sign of God's faithfulness to Daniel and his friends, right? And so the main point I wanted you to see right here is that, right, even though Daniel was in Babylon never owned him. Or to put it another way, Nebuchadnezzar was not Daniel's ultimate king, right? Daniel had another king, right? It was God who continued to be his king throughout the time when he was in Babylon. Because another thing that you see in this passage, right? You see what Daniel does, but you also see how the officials of Babylon, what their mentality is, right? And so, if you go back to verse 3 in chapter 1, we find out that the name of this the king's eunuch is named Ashpenaz, right? So that's the guy that Daniel goes to make this request, right? In verse 10. So the chief of the eunuchs, right? This is Ashpenaz, and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, "I fear my lord the king," right? Nebuchadnezzar, "who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age, so that you would endanger my head with the king?" Right, so if you look at the attitude of Ashpenaz, you see that he was so afraid of Nebuchadnezzar. Right, he's like, if you're not looking nice and plump by the end of 3 years, right, it's going to be my head. Right, I can't risk you not looking good because the king is going to come after me. Right, and so you see that the way that Ashpenaz was, his mentality, right, he was so fearful of King Nebuchadnezzar. But the reason I think why Daniel was able to be faithful to God, right, is because the king didn't own them. Right, they were under the authority of a different king. But and what's interesting here is that if you notice something else, right, the king actually loves Daniel and his friends. The king actually ended up just adoring Daniel and his friends, right? So it says in verse 19, right, and when the king spoke to them, and among all of them, none was found to be like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And then verse 20, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king acquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in his kingdom. Some people have seen a connection there, right? The test was for 10 days, and Nebuchadnezzar sees them as 10 times better. And actually, just to plug our second hour, in our second hour, we're talking about the 7 churches of Revelation, and today we're talking about Smyrna, I think. And then even there, we see there's 10 days of testing, which might refer back to this particular passage, right? So we see the king here just absolutely loved them. Right? He loved Daniel and his friends. And so I think if we put this all together, I think this is what we see. Right? The reason why Daniel was able to be such a blessing to the people around him, right, is because the king did not own them. And my point is that I think that's true for us today as well. And what I mean by that is we will be of the most benefit to the world when we are not being controlled by the world. Rather, we are out to serve God. Right? Or you will be of the most benefit to work at your workplace when you are not being controlled by the fear of your boss or your company, but you're there to honor God. Right? Or you will be of the most benefit to your family, right? When you're not being controlled by maybe fear of mom and dad or grandfather or grandmother, but you're there to honor the Lord. And so to give you a really good example of this, I was listening to this podcast, and there was this woman who was sharing on this podcast who was always being verbally abused by her father, right? All throughout childhood, all throughout young adulthood, all throughout middle age, right? Well, she was in middle age, but all throughout her life, she was constantly being verbally abused by her dad. Now, being a Christian, she wanted to honor her father and mother. Right? But honoring your father and mother doesn't mean that we just subject ourselves to abuse, right? That's not the same thing. And so she was thinking, right, how can I honor my mother and father as God has told me to do? How can I forgive my dad as God has told me to do, but not be subject to this constant abuse, right? Because we shouldn't do that either. And so she came up with this really creative strategy. And so she said, all right, Dad, I'm going to call you every single week because you're my dad and I love you and I want to honor you. But if you say anything that is abusive towards me, I'm just going to hang up. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm not going to, say, Dad, that was not right. I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to hang up the phone. And so you can imagine that the conversations were pretty fast in the beginning. Conversation starts, Dad would say something, she hangs up. And she said to, hey, Dad, don't worry, I'm going to call you next week. Right? I'm going to hang up on you, but I'm going to call you next week. And so she did this through years and years, and after weeks of calling, right, he started to understand it. Right? The dad started to get it. It's like, oh, that was not right. That's something I shouldn't have said. And week after week, I think their relationship began to improve. And I think on the podcast, she even said that, still it's not perfect, right? Still, sometimes Dad would say things that he's not supposed to, but I think the reason why even some kind of reconciliation was possible right? Because she had it on her heart that she said, Dad, I'm not controlled by you anymore. My identity is not from you. My identity is not based on what you say that I am, but I have a different king. I have a different authority in my life. And yet this king calls me to love you, and so I'm going to love you. All right, so when God is our king, I think that's when we will be of the most benefit to the world around us. Right, when we're being controlled by this world, we're just going to be out there to get what's ours, right? You might push others down to get ahead, or you might, seek out relationships that will only be a benefit of you one day, right? And I think it's hard, if not impossible, to be a blessing to others when you're also living in fear of others. But when God is our king, right, when God is really our king, right, he empowers us to love our neighbors. He empowers us to look out for the poor and underprivileged, to stick out our necks for what it's right. And in many ways, this is what it means to be a Christian. Right, to be a Christian is to be under a new authority, right? Is to have this new king over your life. Right, to be a Christian is not just to, be a good person or have a moral code or ascribe to certain beliefs. Not that those things aren't important, but to be a Christian is this entire movement into this brand new reality where we're under a new authority with God as our king. And I think only by doing so can we actually be a really huge blessing to the people around us. There is a quick warning that I have to give you here because it's also in this passage as well. Because yes, Daniel thrived, and Daniel thrived all throughout his life, but there's also a chance that the book of Daniel could have ended in Daniel chapter 1 because this could have been their heads, right? So in verse 13, it says, "Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you." And then Daniel says, "And deal with your servants according to what you see." Right, so when it says, deal with your servants according to what you see, what that means is when the 10 days are up, you do what you need to do. Right? I'm not eating the king's food. But when the 10 days are up, you do what you need to do. You can reward us, you can punish us, you can execute us, you can do whatever you think needs to be done. Right? But Daniel says, "As I have resolved not to eat the king's food." And so you see, sometimes when we say, right, I'm not crossing that line, in some ways we also have to be prepared for the world to respond to us in a negative way. But in many ways, we do that anyways, right? Because God is our king. And more than anything else, we want to please him, and honor him. And so, yes, you'll be the most benefit to others when God is your king, but and we also need to be prepared to lose it all. So if this is the case, right, how do we do this? Right? What resources, what ability does God give us? Right? How does God encourage us to actually live in this way? Because if you're like me, I'm thinking, I can't do that. I don't have that courage to just do that. I'm an introvert. I don't want to put myself, out there. Like, how do I have this courage to do this? Because I think if we're honest with ourselves, and I think if I was honest with myself, I'm nothing like Daniel, right? I'm most likely, just like those hundreds of other Israelites that came with Daniel, and I'm just like chowing down on the king's food, maybe feeling a little bit of guilt, or maybe be like, man, this food is delicious, compared to what we had in Jerusalem, right? Like, I'm most likely, one of these hundreds of nameless Israelites, who is not Daniel. Right, and so what I also want you to see is, like, where does Daniel get this courage, right? How is Daniel able to make this decision? I think some people want to frame this chapter as kind of like Daniel making this big statement, right? And being like, I'm not eating your food, right? I don't care what you say. Do with me what you will, but in some ways, that's not actually what really happens, right? Because if you look at the chapter, Daniel doesn't just like announce it in front of the whole cafeteria, right? He's like, I'm not eating this idolatrous food, you pagans, right? I'm a worshiper of God, right? Daniel doesn't really do that. So if you look at the verse, he first goes up to the chief of eunuchs, right? Who's the dude all the way in charge, and he says to Ashpenaz, hey, I don't want to eat this food, right? So in verse 10, Ashpenaz actually says, no, I can't do that because I'm scared of the king, and he's going to cut my head off if you're not, you're not eating the food. And so he says, I can't risk that. It's not going to work. So in verse 11, you notice that he's actually talking to a different person, right? He talks to the steward whom Ashpenaz puts in charge over them. All right, so Ashpenaz says no, the head guy. So he goes to the second guy and says, hey, will you accept this 10-day challenge and allow me to eat vegetables and water? And so my point is, I think when we stand for God, we don't have to be obnoxious, about it. I think sometimes Christians, really like pump ourselves up. We want to make a big statement for God. And I think oftentimes, to be honest, it's, somewhat obnoxious or even belligerent at times, when we do that. And I don't think that's what God actually calls us to do. So if you see here, Daniel's respectful. He's very respectful. He is creative, right? The 10-day challenge was an extremely creative thing to do, but yet he was persistent in his resolve not to eat the food. Right, so I think in his mind, Daniel wasn't saying, I'm going to do this great thing for God, because I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to represent God well and to, do all this. But I think rather Daniel was simply saying, right, God, you are the king in my life. Give me the courage to do what is right. Right, I think it's the same for us, right? When the gospel comes into our life, when Jesus is king over our life, right, we will also resolve to honor him in all that we do. And simply taking the attitude of asking God to give us the courage to obey him, right? But yet doing so in a humble, respectful, creative, but yet persistent way. And I think that's a really hard thing to do, right? Because the world is, always telling us to privatize our faith, right? Keep it to yourself. Don't let it spill out to the other areas of your life. But we know that as a Christian, we can't do that, right? To be a Christian means to have God's be our authority in our lives for our entire life. All right, so it's not easy obeying God in a culture that is more hostile to our faith. But I don't think it's going to do us any good, right? To go out there thinking, having all this pressure that we're going to stand up for God. But I think a better place to start, right, is for each one of us to ask ourselves, who is king in my life? Right? Who is king in my life? And then asking God, kind of for that quiet courage, right, to honor him in everything that we do. And so that's really the main point that I wanted to, get across to you, right? That this is what allowed Daniel to thrive. Right? Even though he was in Babylon, Babylon never owned him. Right? Babylon was never his king. Nebuchadnezzar was never his king. He was always God who was his king. And the second thing, and we'll cover this a little bit quicker, that allowed him to thrive is that he attributed all of his success to God. It's actually 2 times in this passage. I only give you one here, but 2 times in this passage, you see the phrase, and God gave, right? And God gave. And in verse 9, well, I meant to say, in some ways, I think of like Joshua, right? Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be frightened, do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go, right? So I see that the same thing that God says to Joshua, God kind of says to Daniel, right? Be strong and courageous. I am with you wherever you go. But, all right, so if you look at verse 17, it says, God gave, right? And it says, for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And so notice, right, Daniel's the one who's writing this book, right? And Daniel says, and God gave. Right, as the author of this book, Daniel doesn't say, hey, look how smart I am, look how accomplished I am, look how courageous I am, look how smart I am. Daniel says, and God gave me wisdom and skill in learning all things. I think as humans, we have, really a good habit of attributing our success, right, mainly as a product of our hard work and our intelligence, and our good decision making. And in some ways, I think that's true. Right? A part of it is that. I think we also fail to recognize how large a part our success is dependent on others. Right? It's dependent maybe even on our family background or the culture that we were brought up in or the privileges that we have, because as part of our society, or even random opportunities, or even like which boss you get put under. Right? And sometimes is a huge contributing factor to your success. Right? I've never worked outside of ministry. I'm just talking to someone about this, and most of my understanding of what it's like to be in the marketplace comes from the movie Office Space, which I hear is incredibly accurate, and also talking to Amy about stuff. And so, or if you're in the medical profession, I just imagine your life to be like Scrubs. If you ever remember Scrubs, the TV show back in the early 2000s, right? I just imagine what your everyday life is like, and but. From what I can tell, right, you can get a promotion at work, and you think, oh, I got a promotion because I deserve it, right? And you probably do. But maybe it's also because you happen to be put on a team where a spot opens up above you, or where other qualified people are stuck on teams, right, where there's no opportunity for them to advance. Or sometimes your success is based on what project you get put on. So like, and just so happens that the project that you're on ends up doing really well, while other promising ones end up failing. So I was listen to this podcast about, it was about this man called Sir Clive Sinclair. I don't know if anyone has heard of Sir Clive Sinclair. You probably never heard of him. But he was a computer whiz and a business Mongol, and he really was rivaling Steve Jobs and Bill Gates in the 80s. But his big failure came when he tried to launch an electric car in 1985. And he said that battery-operated cars are going to be the future of automobiles, right? He made this grand declaration, and he said, this is the future of cars. But as you can imagine, in 1985, the world wasn't quite ready for him, right? So years later, another computer whiz and business Mongol named Elon Musk launches Tesla and becomes a wild success. And so why is it that none of us has ever heard of Sir Clive Sinclair, but almost all of us have heard of Elon Musk? Is one smarter than the other, right? Not necessarily. If you look at his life, not necessarily, but much of our success in life depends on much more, right, than our own abilities, right? So much of life depends on other opportunities that we have. And so I think it's important for us, it's important for our successes, right, not to make us proud, but to also see it as a gift from God, right? Daniel was able to remain humble. Why? Because he saw his success as a gift from God. Right, even his intelligence, even his natural ability to learn and to do all that, he said, this is a gift that God has given to me. And it's only when we do that will we really be able to be a blessing to others. Right, when we're prideful because of, look at who I am, right? We're always going to look down on people, right? Or maybe we'll be really envious of people who are way smarter than us. Right, but it's only when we see God as, God, you have given me this set of talents, abilities, opportunities, right? And I'm going to use it to my best ability to honor and to bless you, right? That's really how we can really be a blessing to others. And so let me just say this as we close here. Really the reason why we can be faithful to God, right, is because Jesus was faithful to us. Right? If you look at this passage, our king is not one like Nebuchadnezzar, who rules out of fear. Right? Our king is one who humbled himself and took on the role of a servant, right, to save us from sin and death. Right? Our Savior, right, isn't just one that didn't want to defile himself with the king's food. We see throughout Jesus' life that he was completely undefiled so that we can become the righteousness of God, so that we can become holy like Christ is. And so in some ways, if you look at this passage, there's actually two tables of the king in this passage, or two versions of the king's food. Right, one of them looked magnificent, right, with meats of various kinds, with oil and fat and salt and spices, and the other just vegetables and water. Yet the blessings that come from our King will far outweigh the treasures of this world. So like Daniel, may God allow us to remain faithful to him all the days of our lives as we eat before his table and eat his food, looking to him for our promises and our blessings. Let's pray together. God, you know that it is not easy being in a world, living in this world and being faithful to you. Father, we know that you know this because your son Jesus came into this world and was exposed to temptations of all kinds. But you have done that so that you actually understand all the temptations that we have gone through. You understand all the temptations and trials and struggles that we go through because Jesus, you went through them yourself. And God, it's not easy to live in this world, to be faithful to you. But Father, you continue to encourage us, you continue to empower us, you continue to give us a community that we're able to encourage one another, to bear with one another, to lift up one another before you. And Father, I pray, and we know that this is a process, but we pray that you would put on each and every single person here, that you would put on our hearts that, God, you are a king, and we want to quietly and have the courage to honor you all the days of our life. Father, we don't know the trials that you will have before us, and many of us perhaps have already gone through so many trials of our own. But Father, I pray that as each one of them comes, Father, that we would seek to praise you and honor you in the midst of it, and that may you receive the glory from our lives. In Jesus' name I pray.